Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So today we're gonna be using single or default versus first or default. So I have a controller here. So this is an API controller. We're trying to get some data. I'll show you the database. And we're trying to use first or default here, but we're gonna start with single or default. So we're gonna see the difference here. So basically I'm calling my context, then my product model, and now I'm going to use single or default async. So with this option, what the method's going to do is going to iterate through all the possible values that match 2 for product price. Let's just go to the database real quick so I can show you what I'm talking about. So notice that the product price here, we have this one, which is the X bar. This is going to be $2, and it's the only product that has that specific price, $2. So that means if I'm using the single or default method, this is not going to give me any exception because it's just going to get one single value. If I use first or default and I have more than one value that is $2, then there's not gonna be exception. It's gonna be catching the first value, but it's not gonna be an exception. So let's see this in action. So if I'm using single or default with 2 and I go to the application, I refresh this, I'm gonna have this product price 2, the X bar. So that's perfect. So here's the deal. If I go back to the application and I try to put a value here that is repeated, let's see which one we can use here. So we could use 1. Notice that 1 is for Axe soap and for this printer. So we got this number 1 repeated. So if you guys are using single or default for 1, if I save this, I already run the application. So if I refresh this, then I'm going to have an exception. That's basically what happens with the single or default method. So when the database has more than one result for a specific criteria, in this case, that was ID number 2 or price number 2, whatever item you're trying to look for that is more than one, then you're going to have this exception. If we go back to the application and we try to use first or default, and I save this again, I'm not going to have an exception with that method because that one's going to allow me to have repeated value, but it's going to show me only one value. So notice here. So it's going to start the iteration. It's going to go for pencil because pencil here is the first value. So it knows that there's another value here, Axe soap, that is also $1, and there's another one here. There is the printer. Oh, there's actually like 3 values that are $1. But notice that there's no exception here. That's basically the main difference when using these two methods. So I'm going to try to use single or default again with a value that doesn't exist. And let's see what happens. So single or default async with a price that we don't have in the database. So let's say it's going to be 4,000. Notice that we don't have any 4,000 here. So if I go to the application again, we try to refresh this. Okay, let me see if I didn't save it. Sorry. Okay, let's try to save this again. Okay, I'm gonna try to run this up again, 'cause, well, sometimes there's like this issue. So Control F5, and let's see what happens. So if there's no price for that, you see that nothing's happening. Let's try to inspect this, and I'm gonna try to go to network. I'm gonna try to hit the endpoint again. So API products. We'll see that we have a status 204, but nothing's actually happening here. So it's basically like it's giving you kind of a null value. So if we open this, we got a get, we got an API endpoint, and we got a status code 204. It's basically trying to get something, but because the method uh, basically cannot find that result of 4,000, just doesn't give you anything here. Okay, let's try to use the other methods. So if I use first or default for a value that doesn't exist either. So notice that the issue is going to be similar here. So I'm gonna have API products. Let's try to clean this again. And let's try to hit the endpoint again. And we'll see that the error is similar. I mean, it's not actually an error, but because that doesn't exist, there's nothing. It's not gonna show you anything basically. So let's try to debug this so we can take a look at this in a more proper way. So let's try to just close this. And now let's try to put a breakpoint here. So we're going to be using a first or default. We're going to try to run this again. And because we don't have this $4,000, we'll see what happens. So let's just keep going down. And we'll see this 4,000 here, but because it doesn't exist, let me just make this kind of bigger. Come here to all prods, which is my collection that I filter here. You'll see this result here. All products, async state null, exception null, result null. So it's basically giving you a null result because we don't have these $4,000 in the database. So now let's try to go back to the real example. So singular default is not going to allow you any good response if the value is repeated. Remember, so if I put one with singular default, so single or default, if I run this again with the same breakpoints, this is going to give me an exception. Let's try to do that again. So API products, and let's just go here, and we'll have the exception, but also here we'll see that we have the same problem. It's basically you cannot have two results, you have to have only one. So let's try to stop this, and let's try to go to the database, and I'm going to pick 50 because 50 is a number that is not repeated. So that's gonna work with 50 definitely. So it's not gonna give us an exception. So if I try to run this again and I try to hit the endpoint, and then I just come here, you'll see that there's no exception. So all products, then if I go to results, I'm going to have my math book. If I go to the database, I'll have my math book for product with a price of $50. So there's no exception here because we used single or default. I'm not going to have any exception either if I use first or default, because that one's going to allow me more than one value if you want to. So I'm just going to run this and I'm basically going to have the same result. So the math book. So if I hit here, API/products, then I'm going to have the same result here. So, I'm sorry, let's 50, right? So all products, result, then this is my math book. Exactly the same. I'm not gonna have any issue with first or default. So let's say, what's the problem here or the decision that you have to make here? So if you're actually with working with IDs, like an ID has to be like unique. So that's why, like, if you're looking for IDs, you shouldn't be using this. Maybe you'll be using single or default. So it all gives you an exception if for some reason you have an ID repeated, which I mean is almost impossible if you set up the database in a good way, right? But that's one scenario. Another scenario is like you're trying to avoid that something else is repeated. Let's say this is not a price, but we're talking about unique results, like you need statistical values or something like that. So you don't want that to have more than one result. So for that scenario, for that rule, you're going to be using single or default. Okay. But notice that in the two cases, either if you're using single or default or first or default, you're going to have another kind of exception if the value doesn't exist. So let's do the last trial. So I'm going to be using, I want to get another exception. So single or default async for let's say $100,000. So $100,000. I'm not going to debug it from here. I want to see the exception here. So let's say API products. And there's no exception because the value is not repeated. What I'm going to have here is actually like nothing, like it's going to give me this 204 response. So here, 204. So for this scenario, you'll have to actually debug it. That'll be a better option. So let's try to just kind of hit a couple of endpoints. No exception here, but a null value. So it's just going to return something that is null, basically. So all products, results, and you'll see that it's null. It's not a zero, it's a null value, okay? Okay, perfect. And if we go back to the database and we try to repeat something else, so, well, it looks like only one. Oh no, 12 is also repeated. So I want to get an exception with 12. So I want this price to be 12. If I run this again with single or default, I'm going to have an exception because that method is not going to allow me to repeat values. So if I hit here the endpoint, and if I just debug from here, there you go. You got the exception. And this exception actually tells you everything clearly. Sequence contains more than one element. That's it. That's all you needed to know for this. Let's just go back to the application and let's try to run the same thing but with first or default for number 12. There's not going to be exception there. It's just going to iterate through this value 12 and it'll basically stops there. So it's not going to go to the second one. So it iterates only until it fetches the very first value. But it's not going to throw you an exception. So let's just go back here and let's say API products. Okay. Well, products, result, then 12. You're going to have the first value, which is notebook with ID 500000. You can see that it's right here. So this method tends to be faster, like first or default it tends to be faster than single or default because as soon as it gets the first value, it fetches that value. The other one, because it doesn't allow second or third or more than, like repeated values, so it's going to keep iterating. So it's going to take longer. But yeah, like it depends basically on your business rules, whatever you're using that method for. That's basically something that I wanted to show you guys. That's the only, that's the main difference from these two methods that are really, really important for C Sharp and APIs and, calling data from databases. So I hope you guys like the video and I'll see you in the next video.